There we are.
There we are.
Hello. Hello, Heather. Hello, everybody. Um, Here we are beaming in with only a few days between this and our last time. So good for us. I hope we can keep doing this. This time, Heather and I were chatting before coming on here, and I was going to say Heather is ticked off. Heather thought that was tame. So I'll say Heather is pissed off about many things, but one thing in particular that we thought we'd talk about today.
Well, I'm going to go one further and say Heather is incandescent with rage.
Ooh.
I am, I do not have a short temper. I have like virtually no temper, but boy, when it goes, man. So this thing that Trump has pulled in Washington, D.C., and everybody, the deployment of certain troops in Washington, D.C., and the federalization or the oversight of law enforcement in Washington, D.C., is, to my mind, a demonstration of power. I mean, he did a very similar thing in Los Angeles. And in fact, those troops did very little except demonstrate the federal government's power.
Power and weakness.
Pardon me?
Power and weakness, right? So they're demonstrating power, but they only need to do that because they're weak.
Well, that's a good corrective, because where I am with that is I am so freaking sick of the media and everybody jumping whenever Donald Trump does anything. And I am beyond it. I am at this point feeling like we, the American people, need to say something that I said to you earlier that I won't repeat live, and stop jumping when they say to jump, and instead start telling them what their jobs are, start redefining them as un-American, start saying, you don't understand what a democracy is, and this is what our government should do. You know, it's not just the troops in Washington, D.C. or in L.A. There's a lot of things that shouldn't be happening. There are things like, I'm sorry, concentration camps I'm not okay with. You know what? I'm also not okay with the fact that our system is rigged so that the very wealthy are walking away with the store. I'm not okay with the fact that childcare is almost impossible for people to afford. And don't even start me on housing. I mean,
yes, there's
prison gerrymandering. It's just everything.
Yes. No, that's totally right. And your larger point is, so often we're being reactive, right? So often we're reacting to those acts rather than stepping forward and defining what's right and defining ourselves. And, it's easy. I realize it's easy for us to say this, but everything that we see is so reactive to the extreme actions that these people are taking. And that's not a winning strategy. That allows them to do things. We talked about this many moons ago. Allows them to do things like claim the flag, right? The flag is theirs, which is part of why during some of the marches, people are encouraged to walk around with flags. Because you know what? The flag doesn't belong to them. The flag belongs to us all. So it's easy to see through the blinders that they are imposing on Americans, but the blinders are theirs. The blinders don't represent reality. So yeah, I'm pissed off too, pissed off on many levels. But what we can talk about is, what can history tell us about how we can get from being kind of pissed off to something else?
Well, yeah. So that's the real question. Like I'm there. I'm 100%. And by the way, they can't have the flag anymore. I mean, J.D. Vance, Donald Trump, that whole administration, they can't have that flag. That's my flag. They can have the Confederate flag. That's the one they want anyway.
Well, that's the one they want anyway. So
taking back the American flag. But the trick for me is looking at how people have, in similar circumstances, and I always point to the 1850s, the 1890s, and the 1930s, have taken a period in which the government has been taken over by a very small group of people who are trying to impose an oligarchy, not quite as bad as we're at now, and how they managed to reclaim American democracy. But the real piece for me that I would like to hear you talk about is how the people who became the founders of the United States of America through the Declaration and then later the Constitution managed to turn colonists from being very happy subjects in 1763 to becoming citizens in 1776, because that's like 13 years. They go from, yeah, we want to be king, we want to be subjects of the king, to screw you, we're going to have our own country. And that's, that's a pretty short period of time, considering we're already at least 9 years into Trump.
Well, what's important to know about that chunk of time, I think Americans have a sense of the revolution that, like, Americans, the colonists took up a flag and said, revolution, and then like charging off into a haze of glory. And the fact of the matter is, when you take a ground level look at what was happening during the revolution, you have a society of colonists who were happy being British subjects. And initially, they were angry about their rights as British subjects being violated. All of the protests and things that often I think Americans interpret as the American spirit, they were doing it because their British rights, their rights as British subjects, were being violated. And that's where a lot of the anger from the revolution, well, from the pre-revolutionary years, these early years, came from, because they felt that their rights were being violated. But that goes on for quite some time. And it ends up being kind of a vicious cycle in which Americans protest, and then the British say, no, like, that's a little too harsh. You know what? We're going to come back with this act. And then the colonists respond, and then the British come back with something. But at a certain point, 1775, 1776, Americans by that point had tried every avenue within the British political system. They had petitioned. They had sent people to the British court. They had put agents in Parliament. They had maneuvered with people, insiders in Britain. They had protested physically, which actually isn't a new thing. It's a very old and traditional thing. They had deployed every aspect of traditional British systemic protest. And what happened at the end in 1776, what's important to realize, as they're thinking about maybe we need to declare independence, even then, they send a petition to Britain one last time, thinking, maybe the olive branch petition, maybe this will be the one. And it's when the king refuses to read it, to take it, that Americans realize all of their avenues have been closed. And now it's time to do something dramatic. That's where the Declaration of Independence comes from. It's a testament to years of struggle. And it was an enormous big deal to people at the time, because they were surrendering something that, in essence, they had fought for all of those years. So one thing the revolution shows us is that these things take time, that people cling to what's been there before, that they don't want radical change, but that at a certain point, people realize that there must be change, because the road we're going down is a dead end. There's no room for us.
Yes, but what you're saying is actually the same thing that happened in the 1850s and the 1890s and then in the 1930s. That is that those people who were demanding reforms to the government were not asking for something new. They were asking for something old.
Well, that's precisely it. That's what the revolutionaries were doing. We've always operated this way. So let's keep operating this way. Why are you doing this? You don't do this to people in Great Britain, like in England. So why are you doing this to us? So yeah, in a sense, the revolutionaries were conservative.
So, which is exactly what Abraham Lincoln says. That's when he calls himself a conservative. And often what I talk about when I say I'm a Lincoln conservative is he keeps saying, hey, listen, you people call us radicals. You Democrats who wanted to push slavery into the American West, call us radicals because we want to stop you. But we're the ones standing on the Declaration of Independence. We're the conservatives. And that's where you get the idea of him being a conservative, which you often hear in right-wing circles now, seeming to say that he would agree with them now, and he 1,000% wouldn't. But the question for me is, when I look at the revolution, I want to know how they brought people around to that position. So you said protests. letters? I mean, how do you make people understand that when Donald Trump puts declares that there is this crazy crime wave in Washington, D.C., when in fact crime is at its lowest point in 30 expletive years, that this is not about making sure people can walk safely on the streets. And by the way, I spent a ton of time in Washington. I have never had a problem
Likewise.
with the streets
I
of
mean,
Washington.
I'm going to start talking and get even more pissed.
Yeah,
Likewise, and right now I'm in New York. Shut up.
exactly. But how do you make people understand that that's crap, and that in fact what they are losing is the right to have control by the people of the power, the police power of the state, which is freaking huge.
Right.
As well as the fact they're losing their due process, which is, those two things are central to the establishment of a democracy. How do you do that? Literally, like what do I do when I walk out this door tonight?
Well, ironically, what we have now is a different state of challenge than what the founding generation had. Their challenge was, how the hell do you communicate beyond where you are? Right? They went to newspapers, they wrote petitions. Actually, newspapers were huge. They created networks of people and newspapers trying to get people in other areas to understand what was going on. And there were some big things like the Stamp Act, which, there are a lot of other acts that people could say, well, this is affecting me, but the Stamp Act taxed part of everyday life, right? They taxed licenses and playing cards and newspapers. And colonists understood at that moment, it wasn't just them. It was everybody. So part of what goes on throughout this time period is that the colonists are struggling to get messages out. And the more that the British are trying to calm things down, the more obvious it is to the colonists that they're not being treated like British subjects. But the problem for them is it's hard for them to communicate. The problem for us is it's too easy to communicate, that there's, 800 avenues where we can get 500 versions of disinformation. Same problem, just the opposite end of the spectrum. So you're right. The question is, how do you get the people engaged? And the part of that question, the value of that question is, if you don't do that, nothing's going to happen. Right? The revolution wasn't 8 guys in a room with, frock coats and quill pens, right? The revolution was on the streets, but it took a lot of pushing and communication and local change, local feelings of local enforcement of things that seem different, and newspapers teaching people again and again and again, this is not just happening here. It's happening everywhere. This isn't, and even if it wasn't happening in your location, horrible things are happening in Boston. And Americans understood pretty quickly, if they can do that to Boston, they can do that to any of us.
Okay, so is that I'm hearing you, and I'm thinking the piece of this current administration that everybody is feeling are the tariffs and the economy. And the tariffs haven't really kicked in yet. And once again, Trump has put off the Chinese tariffs for another, I think it's 90 days, maybe it's 60 days. I always have trouble 6s and 9s, but that's something that you can't miss. This 50% tariff on products from Brazil is going to hit coffee, among other things. So just shoot me now. But is it tariffs or something like that, or is it one of the things that really truly horrifies me are these detention camps. Right. And yet there seems to be an almost blackout of information on those, and the real, especially for the one in the Everglades, which I refuse to call by that cutesy name. There really is an attempt to black out what's actually happening there. I mean, is that something that will wake people up? I mean, and I shouldn't put it that way. I know a lot of people are awake and are concerned, but we just have to stop letting the MAGA Republicans, who are a very small percentage of this country, define our future. We must define our future. How do we do that?
And part of that has to do, and this is going to be obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway, part of that has to do with not allowing ourselves to say, well, these are other people in those camps. right? So that's not really affecting us on a daily basis. Now, in the semi-recent past, now American citizens are being affected. That's, if unfortunately, if you see people feeling a more immediate sense of threat to their lives, of threat to their everyday existence, of threat to their rights, of threat to food, of threat to the many things that we just take for granted and that we feel we deserve as Americans. If any of those things, if Americans come to believe that those things are honestly being threatened, that's a moment to take the emotion of that moment and awaken people, alert people, point out to people that what's happening is an attack on your rights, an attack on what you believe America to be, and then what they're doing is not American by any means. And no matter how often they claim it is, it isn't.
See, what's worrying me is that I think that's going to happen. I think the cuts to Medicaid, and we're already seeing these really high requests by insurers to state boards to have really high increases in insurance premiums. I think the cuts to SNAP are badly going to hurt markets, especially food markets, especially those in rural areas. The jobs, the fact we're not producing new jobs, the tariffs. I mean, I think everyone's going to see it quickly. I'm looking at September and October, but that being said, this thing in DC, which let's be honest, is at least partly to distract from the Epstein files. But I think that the people in the administration are working really hard to consolidate power before they lose Trump. Because the other thing that showed up in today's press conference is he is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. I mean, he is not going to make it 3.5 more years. And yet he's the one with the political support. So if they can get all that, all the systems in place, they can just shoehorn JD Vance in there and we'll be stuck with what we got. And that, I guess maybe that's why I was so freaking angry this morning, is because that, I think, is the long game. And all these people who are sort of smugly laughing about, oh, well, the libs are getting owned, don't seem to be aware. You know what it feels like? It feels like the House, maybe I'll write about this. It feels like the House divided speech, where everybody was reacting to, a Supreme Court decision or something that Congress did or something that, the president did. And it was Lincoln who stood up and said, look, they're framing a House. They're putting all these pieces in place. And if you think that they're doing that randomly, you're nuts, because what they're doing is they're creating a new nation based in human enslavement. And I feel like we're at that moment now where you look at all the pieces. They are building Project 2025. They are building Christian nationalism for the benefit of a very few people. And the smug sort of laughing like this isn't really happening is really getting to me.
Well, yeah, we vented about all the smugness. But here's the thing underlying some of what you just said, Heather, and that is right now, the left doesn't have a narrative, right? Lincoln said he created a narrative. This is what's happening. They're building something. And that's a narrative that grabbed people. Right now, the left doesn't have a narrative. The left has, well, this is bad, and this is bad, and this is bad. Gets us back to where we started. We're reacting in one way or another. I think that the left needs to step forward with a really clear, plain, straightforward discussion of how the things that are happening now are fundamentally not American. They need to create a narrative of what's happening that will grab people so that they will get beyond individual moments in which, oh, why is my food so expensive? Oh, why can I not get coffee anymore? All of those things feel local. But if Americans can understand, like my Stamp Act guys understood, that what's happening here is happening everywhere, and that it's a big thing. It's not just a you thing. There's a power in that.
Yeah, just one thing. I would not call myself on the left. I would call myself a liberal, and I think that's what you're talking about. And even by our definition, a conservative. I mean, that's exactly what Lincoln did. The attempt to rejuvenate and to stand firm on the freaking Declaration of Independence, the idea that we are all created equal, we have a right to a say in our government and a right to equal access to resources, and the Constitution, which says we have a right to be treated equally before the law. That is not radical leftness.
That's conservative.
That's conservative. That is the vast majority of us.
And basically everyone knows that, right? That's the stuff we were raised on. That's the stuff we learned in second grade.
No, everybody does not know that. That's the problem. I feel like we have lost that. And you know what I think? I think you and I have our marching orders because nobody else is doing it. So I guess it's up to people like us.
That's why we've been doing what we've been doing for the recent years, right? That's why we're here, because it feels as though in one way or another, American exceptionalism, among other things, is blinding Americans to what's happening right in front of them. And the assumption that it's always okay, it's going to be okay because it's always been okay, and that we are exceptional to all the rules that govern the rest of the world, that has put blinders on people in a way that even now, even at this point where it's in our face, people aren't necessarily seeing the threat that's right in front of us. They're not seeing it. And you and I have been screaming about this for years, trying for all of those years to get people to listen, to look, to think. You know, what I find myself thinking about a lot, I guess it's related to what we said here, is thinking about where we are and what we're seeing and how some people still don't see the threat in this moment, right? Even now, don't see the threat in this moment. And what you and I are saying here is, okay, maybe not everyone understands democracy and not everyone understands what our rights are, or not everyone understands the sorts of things that we are talking about. But if you can be in this moment and you can see the National Guard being marched on Washington for no reason, you can see people being shipped to who the heck knows where with no due process. You can see American citizens being threatened in that way. You can see threats to just like throw away homeless people. Who knows where they go? You can see things that you know in your heart are not American. You need to acknowledge what you're seeing and, in a sense, create your own narrative. What does it add up to? That's in the 1850s. Part of what happened was people in the North saw, and I've written about Congress, so I'm talking about Congress now, but people in the North saw that Southern members of Congress were bullying, silencing, doing whatever the heck it took to silence Northerners on the subject of slavery. What changed was when Northerners saw that, and they began electing people who were going to fight back against it. People need to own the narrative. People need to see what's happening.
Yes, and you know, just to clarify, a lot of us do see it, but yes. I guess what frustrates me are those who still don't.
Well, that's the thing, and no matter how loud we yell, I mean,
it's not even the MAGAs. I don't expect them to come.
No.
People who are just not paying attention are.
I don't. Yeah.
Frustrating.
Yeah. No, it's true, and I like the fact that we are here, in a sense, venting. Because, you know, you and I have been yelling, writing, speaking about this for years. And I think it's a good thing that we're stepping forward and saying, come on, you know, like we're at a moment where it really matters. Not that you and I matter, but what we're talking about, what we're losing, what's being taken, what we're watching really fundamentally matters. I got to quote Hamilton. Hamilton says in one of the Federalist essays, you know, I got to do that. He talks about how once you allow your fundamental rights to be taken away, you will be very hard pressed to get them back. And that's where we are.
And that seems like a great place to end this tonight. I'm sorry if I was venting too much, but man, that smug little smile.
That there are many things that drive me crazy, but that, because you can see it.
Yeah, and they know that they know what they're doing, and
they assume they'll never be accountable.
And assuming they will never be held accountable. That's right. That's right. Although, as you just pointed out, and that I think is really important, these are signs of weakness, not signs of strength. We cannot believe their propaganda. But
That's it.
boy, is it long overdue for us to say we're moving on now. You know,
Right.
we're gonna go ahead and redefine this country the same way that we did in the founding era, in the 1850s, in the 1890s, in the 1930s. By God, it's high time.
We stand for something and it matters.
Yep. Yep. All right.
Okay.
On that cheery note, Rosie's back there screaming her little heart out.
Rosie is like, has much to say. Yeah.
On that cheery note, I actually have already gotten a lot of exercise today, but I think I need more, and you should get it too.
I'm not exercising. I'm sipping a martini. So,
well, I need to get more exercise, I think, or I won't sleep tonight either. Anyway, thanks again, as always. And thank you everybody for being here.
yes.
We'll be back. We intended to do this Thursday, but things seem to be happening. So maybe we can do it.
But we're going to keep doing it more often, which makes me so happy, Heather.
Maybe we can do it Thursday too. I mean, don't write that down, anybody, yet, but
I know, but we talked about it.
But yeah, that's right. That's right. All right. All right. We'll do it again soon.
Okay. And I love you.
I love you, Joanne. Talk to you later.
Okay. Bye, everybody.